Okay, everybody. Welcome, biology, cells, and tissues. We're jumping into the lymphatic system. This one, what I'm going to say is there's a lot of information on these slides. I'm going to hit on the most important things. If I skip over anything, please make sure you go back and just take a look at it. I've reorganized and redone everything so that it flows really, really nicely. And everything is a lot more detailed on the slides themselves. So, when we talk about, first things first, when we talk about the lymphatic system, again, with a lot of science courses, you can get these AKAs. So when it comes to the lymphatic system, you might see lymph system, you might see lymphatic, you might see lymphoid, anything like that. You're talking about the lymphatic system. Okay, don't worry if it's different words. It all is referring to the exact same thing. All right. So when we talk about the lymphatic or the lymphoid system, the main functions are the following. It returns interstitial fluid to the blood, filtration of the lymph, filtration of the blood, as well as the defense of the body from invasion and damage by microorganisms and or foreign substances. First part that we're going to kind of jump into is returning the interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds the cells in our tissues. When we are delivering nutrients to our tissues, one of the ways that we do this, and this is kind of something that we're going to learn more about, go more in depth, in Physiology 1 in Trimester 2. But our blood goes to the capillaries, and the capillary and fluid actually leaks out from the capillaries and carries the nutrients and stuff with it. The way that happens is through a pressure system going from high pressure to low pressure. And again, that's going to be covered more in depth in next trimester. So don't worry too much about all of that now. Just understand the fluid that goes out is the lymph fluid, or is the interstitial fluid. Some of that interstitial fluid gets sucked back into the capillaries and back into the blood, but a little extra ends up being left behind. And so that is absorbed by the lymphatic system to circulate it and put it back into the blood to make sure we don't have swelling or edema. Okay, and actually this looks like a little bit of repeat slides. Let me delete that first one. Okay. So the last chunk that we went through, we talked about the cardiovascular system. These two are highly interconnected. Okay, when we talk about the circulatory system, we talked about nutrients delivering, we talked about the oxygen, we talked about waste, we talked about immune system. We talked about almost a lot of these exact same things. All of these connect the lymphatic and the cardiovascular system. And in fact, they're entirely connected because the entire lymph system, the lymph vessels, are going to drain eventually back into the cardiovascular system, which we'll take a look at. Okay, so more of a kind of general knowledge, some of the components that we're going to look at. We're going to talk about the lymph fluid. We're talking about the vascular system, capillaries, vessels, trunks, and then ducts. We'll go into lymphatic tissues and then also the lymphatic organs. There's primary organs and secondary organs, which we will get into. So the lymph fluid. It's a clear, watery fluid that circulates through the lymphatic system. It's formed when that interstitial fluid, which bathes the tissues and cells, is collected by lymphatic capillaries. Lymph fluid contains all of this stuff. It contains white blood cells, especially lymphocytes. Lymph fluid, lymphocytes. These are crucial for their immune responses, all that kind of good stuff. The main function is to return the excess fluid from tissues back to the bloodstream, filter out the foreign stuff, and support the immune system. So talking about lymph capillaries, a term that I really want you guys to know is closed-ended. Okay, closed-ended. What this means is, unlike the circulatory system, where it goes from the arterial side through the venous side and back, and it's a full circle, right? The lymph capillaries don't connect to any other system, okay? They have kind of dead ends in the tissue, which allows the fluid to come in, and so the fluid is only strictly flowing in one direction, and it can't go back at all. Okay, it just means closed-ended. They do not connect to any other vessels at their starting point. We really want to remember that with lymph capillaries. That's the way it's different from our circulatory system. So that's the capillaries. We'll talk about the lymph vessels. You can kind of think vessels along the lines of kind of the venules or the arterioles, comparing the lymph system to the circulatory system. So these are larger tubes. They carry the lymph fluid from the capillaries towards the heart. Along their path, the vessels are interrupted by structures called lymph nodes. We're going to have a whole chunk on lymph nodes. These are some of our secondary lymphatic organs. So we'll talk all about lymph nodes in a little bit, kind of what they do, what their purpose is, all that kind of stuff. Additionally, much like veins, where we saw those one-way valves, our lymph system also has these one-way valves, very similar to the venous system, in order for the lymph to get pushed one direction and so that it doesn't flow backwards. After the vessels, we have the vessels come together and they form lymph trunks. Similar, again, to like the veins and the arteries, the bigger veins, bigger arteries in the circulatory system. So these are large lymphatic vessels. They collect the lymph, and these empty into lymph ducts. So the ducts, these are the largest vessels. Think of this like this is like the aorta or the vena cava. Okay, these are our really, really big ones. These are the ones that we're talking about where everything is converged all together. It collects the lymph from all the trunks and finally returns it to the bloodstream. The two lymph ducts we need to remember are the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. We also want to remember what is each of these drains. So the thoracic duct is our workhorse duct. It's basically all of the body except for the right arm, the right side of the chest, and the right side of the head and the neck. So literally you can look at this graph. Here's the right lymphatic duct. This is the thoracic duct, what's drained. So you can look at this and tell, okay, basically the right side of the head, the right arm, the right chest, right here is the right lymphatic duct, and everything else is the thoracic duct. So the thoracic duct really pulls a lot of weight. This is just another little picture. This is pointing out some of the specific anatomy. We'll see some of these pop up, but you can come back to this. Just familiarize yourself a little bit with some of these different structures. The main one we want to remember when we talk about the lymphatic ducts is that they drain into the subclavian trunk or the subclavian veins. Okay. So both of our lymph ducts end up draining into the subclavian veins. Depending on how you read it, and depending on where you read it, in which textbook or which part, they might not mention ducts specifically. They might just talk about trunks. And sometimes they'll say that trunks empty into the subclavian veins, or the subclavian trunk. This is called where the subclavian and the jugular vein meet. They call that little trunk. But biggest thing to understand is the lymph vessels end and drain into the subclavian veins. That's going to be a test question somewhere along the lines, okay? Let me actually add that into here as a slide. Test question, I promise. The lymph drains into the subclavian vein. Okay, so that is the vessel side of things, that lymph vascular system. We talked about the fluid, we talked about the system. Now we're going to talk about the lymph tissues. So, main functions of the lymph tissues: lymphoid, lymphatic, same thing, doesn't matter, don't worry about it. So the main function, it houses and then provides proliferation. Again, proliferation is the division, the replication sites for the lymphocytes. Remember, we talked about the lymphocytes. We're talking about those white blood cells. Specifically, mostly the B cells and the T cells are the big ones that we're going to be talking about. Okay? And remember that the lymphocytes are actually produced in the bone marrow through the hematopoiesis, but then they travel, they're stored in the lymphoid tissue. Some of them mature in the lymphoid tissue. Other pieces, they're stored in a couple of different places. So we'll look at each of those as well in this presentation. Specifically, the reason why that they use these sites as proliferation sites is because these are vantage points for lymphocytes and macrophages as they filter through the lymph. Essentially, they can hang out, especially like in the nodes. They can essentially get an idea and get, as everything is filtered through, they can kind of be checking and find to see, is there bacteria? Are there other external particles? Are there things that are not supposed to be in the blood or in the lymph that are there? And then they can activate and respond. A lot of our lymphatic tissue is composed of reticular connective tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue. Got lots of macrophages, and some of the spaces between the fibers offer a place for the lymphocytes to occupy when they return from patrolling the body. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's two types specifically of lymphatic tissue that we talk about. Again, lymphoid, lymphatic, means the same thing. We're going to talk about epithelial reticular cells, also known as thymic epithelial cells. This is our thymus, okay? We need to make sure we know both of these. And then we'll have the reticular cells of other lymphatic tissue. So specifically in the thymus, which is kind of what we're going to dive into next, they're epithelial reticular cells. They're derived from the endoderm. It's the embryological layer that they're derived from. They're called epithelial reticular cells. They do not produce reticular fibers, and they participate in the maturation of T lymphocytes. So T lymphocytes are called T lymphocytes. T stands for thymus. Okay, so they're going to be produced originally in the bone marrow, like all of our other blood cells are. And then they travel to the thymus, where they're going to mature and grow into proper T lymphocytes. And we have several different types of T lymphocytes that we'll just touch on now. It's not super important to know all of them right now, but in the future, I just want to mention them because in future courses, we're going to talk about those as well. Okay, finally, the reticular cells of other lymphatic tissue. These are derived from mesenchyme, or mesenchymal cells, that mesoderm. And they do produce reticular fibers, specifically the type 3 collagen fibers. Here's just an example, a picture of those guys, epithelial reticular cells. We're going to see this picture again in a little bit. Here we have the reticular cells, we have the macrophages, we have the reticular cells on reticular fibers, we have lymphocytes, and then we have the reticular fibers themselves. All of these are kind of what make up our lymphatic tissues. We're going to come back to this again, look at each of these a little bit more specifically. But we're the two types of lymphocytes we're looking at. We have the B lymphocytes and we have the T lymphocytes. Okay, so that completes our lymphatic tissue. Again, remember the two types of tissue, essentially the thymus tissue and then all of the other tissue. So epithelial reticular cells, and then reticular cells of other lymphatic tissues. So jumping into the organs, this is going to give us a little bit more specific. Before we start this, there are definitions I want to cover: stroma and parenchyma. Stroma essentially means any of the supportive tissue of an epithelial organ. Okay, the cells, the structures, all that kind of stuff that support the functional, the quote unquote, the functional or the working cells, also known as the parenchyma. So the parenchyma is the tissue of an organ that performs the work of the organ. So for example, if we talk about the thymus, the stroma would be all the supporting cells. The parenchyma would be the cells that actually house and allow the maturation of the T lymphocytes. Okay, that's going to be the difference. That's what we're going to see. So talking about the primary lymphatic organs, first of all, the bone marrow. Again, we covered all of that in the bone lecture, so if you want to go back to the bone lecture. But biggest things to remember are it's the primary site of the hematopoiesis, including red blood cells and lymphocytes. And then the B cell maturation does occur in the bone marrow. T cells are made in the bone marrow, but mature in the thymus. Okay, so the bone marrow is responsible for making these cells. If the B cells do, again, if you connect the dots, B cell, B lymphocyte, bone marrow, T cells, thymus. T goes to thymus, B goes to the bone. Okay? Now the B lymphocytes specifically, these are responsible for what is called humoral or fluid immunity. It just means that it's directly related to the blood. Okay, it's through the bloodstream, through the lymph system, through the fluid system, that we have this this type of immune response. Okay, specifically B cells. A little bit of the process. B cells, when they're activated, they differentiate into plasma cells, and then plasma cells produce antibodies to fight the infection. B cells, this is a little note where you'll understand exactly what this refers to in just a couple of minutes. B cells, they do form nodules or they do form nodes. Okay? Nodules / nodes. I prefer using the term nodes just because nodules is typically taken as a pathological term. However, this professor specifically likes to use the word nodules. If I was the one teaching this entire course, I would personally use nodes over nodules, but that's again just kind of like little semantics things of language. If you see it on an exam, unless it's specifically talking about pathology, use nodes and nodules interchangeably. Okay, don't worry too much about that. Of course, these are produced in the bone marrow, they circulate the blood, and also stored in the lymph tissues. Okay, so that's bone marrow and the B lymphocytes. Now, the primary lymphatic organs we're going to jump into the thymus. So we talk about the thymus. It is lobulated. Lobulated means that it just has lobes. Okay, so there's kind of two lobes. There's a right lobe and a left lobe. There are no nodules on it, so nothing kind of like poking, sticking out. There are no sinuses on it either, so no like indentations, no like storage chunks in there. This will most likely be a test question. The size varies with age. Specifically, our thymus is largest during puberty and during childhood. So a younger person has a much larger thymus, and it shrinks with age. As we get older, our thymus is going to shrink. Kind of think about it. When we're in our early years, especially as a kid and going through puberty, that's when our immune system is really developing. And so it's much, much more active during that time period, and then as you get older and older and older, you tend to not have, your immune system tends to not be as strong. It's also already mostly essentially developed, so it doesn't need to be as active. There is a capsule which surrounds the thymus, and it has these things called trabeculae. So these are kind of like these little thin extensions of the capsule. I think I had a picture of it somewhere. Maybe not. Yeah, here. These trabeculae. So this outer layer is the capsule. And these trabeculae, these kind of like little comings in of the capsule, those are known as the trabeculae, which delineates the lobules. So you have like the lobes, the whole, and these little tinier components are called lobules. So lobe is the whole part, right lobe, left lobe. Lobules are the smaller separations. And these trabeculae go kind of in between those and inside of those in order to like surround everything. Each of our lobules, so each of the smaller parts, has a cortex and also has a medulla. So we'll look at each of those. There's a picture of our thymus right there. Left lobe, right lobe. And then if we zoom in, we can see each of these little kind of chunks. Those are our lobules. So with each of these organs, we're going to talk about stroma and we're going to talk about parenchyma. Okay? The stroma is the supportive connective tissue framework, structural integrity, and organization, known as kind of the skeleton of the thymus. These kind of first two bullet points pop up very similarly onto the other organs, because the stroma is essentially always doing the same job. Now the epithelial reticular cells, remember this is what it's made up of. We mentioned those already. And this is specific to the thymus. The stroma also secretes a hormone-like peptide that's called thymosin. Let's make sure we know that word. Thymosin is responsible for the differentiation of T cells. Like I said, there's several different types of T cells. So you have like the base T cell, and it goes to the thymus, and then as it matures, it can split off to a couple different places thanks to this specific hormone. Okay, that's the stroma. Now the parenchyma. Again, the parenchyma is the functional component of it. We have two parts. We have a cortex, and we have a medulla. Sorry, earlier when I jumped ahead to this picture and I showed trabeculae, this is actually trabeculae of a lymph node, but it's a similar idea and a similar structure as the thymus lobules. Apologies for any confusion that might have caused. Okay, so within the thymus, we have a cortex and we have a medulla. On the cortex, the outer portion, we have thymocytes. Thymocytes are our immature T cells. Remember, T cells, I'm going to keep saying this many, many times, they are produced where? In the bone through hematopoiesis. They travel through the blood, and then they travel through the lymph in order to get to the thymus. And then they mature in the thymus. The T cells mature in the thymus. Then we also have the medulla. This is where we have a higher concentration of the epithelial reticular cells, as well as some larger lymphocytes. So as they mature, they tend to get a little bit larger. We also have another structure that's called Hassel's corpuscles within the parenchyma of the thymus. The information that this professor had is a little bit outdated. The Hassel's corpuscles do play a role in T cell differentiation, as well as kind of function of our immune system. But it's more recent, and the important isn't super Super important. So just understand the hassles, corpuscles. Again, they're in the thymus. They're unique to the thymus. Of course, the thymus also needs blood vessels. Capillaries are located in the cortex, surrounded by a sheath of the epithelial reticular cells. And there's also something called the blood-thymus barrier, much like the blood-brain barrier. I'm going to want to remember this terminology specifically. Essentially, the capillaries in the thymus are continuous. And we talked about the capillary function. There's the continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoid. So they're continuous, meaning that the epithelial walls and they are locked close together, and they have a complete basal lamina. And this to prevent immature T cells from being exposed to antigens, which could then lead to unwanted immune responses or autoimmune reactions. And then it keeps the blood away from the immature T cells. Here's this picture again. We see the epithelial reticular cells of the thymus right here. Here kind of on the side. These are the epithelial reticular cells kind of surrounding some of these other cells. You can see again here some of the lymphocytes poking in there. So these pointing at the arrows, those are some of our lymphocytes. Another picture of the thymus, we have cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside. Cortex, medulla. Just a picture of the hassles, corpuscles. If you recognize, I would say make sure that you know this picture for the lab portion. This is one that's easily thrown in there and be like, okay, hey, what organ is this coming off of? You need to recognize that it's a hassle corpuscle, and then from there you need to recognize that the hassle corpuscle is only found in the thymus. So these T lymphocytes are just kind of the stuff we want to talk about. These are responsible for cell-mediated immunity, also part of what's called our adaptive immunity, which again you don't need to know to all the technical terms and stuff for that. I would just know responsible for cell-mediated immunity. That's a good test question that they can ask. So B is humoral immunity. This is cell-mediated. And there's a bunch of different classes. So you'll see like helper T cells, suppressor or regulatory T cells, cytotoxic T cells, and then memory T cells, okay? You will see this terminology pop up a bunch here and there. You'll dive a lot more into each of these specifically when you get into more of like the general pathology and the pathology courses. You talk a lot more about these specific cells, the different types of T cells, the classes of T cells, and what they do. Another part, T cells do not form nodules, nodes, or nodules. Again, super easy test question. Which of the following do not form nodes or nodules? Or which of the following do form nodes or nodules? The B cells do form nodes. T cells do not. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording here. This has gotten we're about that half-hour mark. So that has completed the primary organs, the primary lymphatic organs. Now we're going to start on the secondary lymphatic organs.